Mediterranean Sea, sometime between the 3rd and the 2nd millennium before the birth of Christ. Historic books, written then like the Iliad and the Odyssey, told stories of brave heroes, memorable deeds, and magnificent cities. The great civilizations of Greece and Rome which followed were inspired by these mythical tales. They recognized their own forefathers in the early heroes, but they could never see the wondrous cities described in the books. They had all been destroyed and abandoned, or been swallowed up by sand or water. Cities such as Ebla, Troy or Mycenae existed only on Homer's pages. But guided by the books, explorers went out and found them, unearthing extraordinary historical evidence and priceless treasures. Now, thanks to modern technology, we can visit these legendary places and follow one man's dream to uncover the civilization of heroes. Fascination with the past and the desire to know about our predecessors has been with us since the dawn of history. The ancient Greeks and Romans also loved to find out about their forefathers. Their attention was concentrated on the cultures of the 2nd and 3rd millennia BC. Among the civilizations that most interested Greek and Roman historians were Egypt along the Nile, Assyria and Babylon on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and also the pre-Hellenic societies of Greece. These were the Minoans of Crete and the Mycenaeans in the Peloponnesus, who inherited their empire. Between Mycenaean Greece and the Orient, there was a city that preyed on ships sailing up the Hellespont to the Black Sea. This city was Troy. The Mycenaeans fought a war against Troy that's captured the imagination of the whole Western world. Troy, once known as Ilios or Ilion, was a thriving Hellenic city. It's proved one of the most beguiling challenges to archaeologists. Many have dedicated their lives to searching for it. But it's not been easy to rouse King Priam or the beautiful Helen or the brave Hector from their obscurity. Troy, the city whose siege was described so eloquently in perhaps the world's most famous book, Homer's Iliad, could have been located anywhere. In 1868, a German archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, decided to invest all the money he'd earned in business to pursue his lifelong dream, to discover the actual places where the heroes of his youth had fought. The Iliad was certainly not an exact scientific work. Before being written about the 5th century BC, it had been handed down orally through generations of storytellers. The epic related events that had happened hundreds of years earlier, yet Schliemann decided to put his faith in the text. Many archaeologists were hunting for Troy, and they were digging on this hill known as Bunabashi, in an area between the Turkish cities of Çanakkale and Ezine. Schliemann, however, was not convinced. He combed the Iliad for new clues. Homer mentioned 2 rivers, the Scamander and the Simoentor. The battles took place around a fortified citadel built on a natural rise in the ground. These details may have been figments of the author's imagination, but Schliemann chose to believe him. This hill, Hisarlik, was quite similar to the Homeric description. It was here where Schliemann started to dig. And in the end, it was here where he found Troy. Nine different cities, one built upon the ruins of another, emerged from the excavation. The second layer yielded amazing treasures: cups and vases, weapons, gold jewellery and buttons. Schliemann thought he'd found King Priam's treasure. We now know that these were not the property of the Trojan king. Modern archaeology, based on rigorous scientific methods, has dated the objects to several centuries before the Battle of Troy, attributing them to a dynasty of the 3rd millennium BC. But Schliemann was convinced. His belief was supported by the evidence of fire in the layer where he found the precious objects. Homer had said that Troy was burnt to the ground by the Mycenaeans, who entered the city after a 10-year siege, thanks to the stratagem of the wooden horse, which now stands in replica on the site. Schliemann thought that the city attacked by the Mycenaeans was the same fortified city he'd excavated, laid out in this plan dated to the 3rd millennium BC. But this city, surrounded by a wall barely 122 meters across, could hardly have stood up to 10 years of siege, nor been big enough to house Priam's extended court. According to recent studies by 2 archaeological teams, in the 2nd millennium BC, the time of the war, Troy was encircled by these much more extensive walls, and they probably were further extended and fortified towards the end of the 1st millennium BC. Relying on descriptions in the Iliad and taking into account recent digs that have uncovered new parts of the city, we can now relive the legendary Siege of Troy. This is what the Mycenaean soldiers would have seen when they landed in force from the sea. The sight of a menacing fleet approaching Troy was probably not unusual for its citizens. The 9 layers that were found at this site correspond to 9 different cities, testifying to many cycles of destruction and rebuilding. We know that Troy, in addition to being strategically important in the control of the sea routes, was the foremost producer at the time of finished and semi-finished gold objects. And so it's no surprise that it attracted the greedy attentions of its neighbors. The conquest of Troy meant not only not having to pay taxes on merchant shipping going to the Black Sea and the Orient, but also taking possession of the gold reserves. And so it was primarily economic motives that drove the Mycenaeans into war, while Homer's account of the beautiful Helen and the courage of heroes like Achilles and Hector has enriched the story with drama and romance. Troy was an extremely wealthy city, appropriately defended by massive walls and extolled by Homer as invincible. That's the reason, after 10 fruitless years of siege, why the Mycenaeans came up with the expedient of the wooden horse.